Greetings, YouTube. My name is Ian Major. I'm an entrepreneur, investor, and all-around raging capitalist. And I am super excited to be kicking off this channel with this inaugural video. Today, I will go a little bit into what the channel is all about, what are some of the topics that I'll be covering and talking about. And then in today's video specifically, we'll be going into this sort of moral argument for capitalism, which is something that I think is talked about far too infrequently. And so on the channel, we'll talk about a whole range of topics, but the overarching thesis, if you will, is what the world needs now fundamentally is something I'll call Bitcoin capitalism. And so we're going to pick each of those apart. We're going to talk about capitalism. We're going to talk about Bitcoin, how they come together, how they can solve and will solve slew of the different challenges that we see in society today. But sort of underpinning that and complementing that, I'm going to talk a lot about macroeconomics, geopolitical topics, all of which flows into the ultimate root of all of this, which is money and the nature of money. It's Saturday, November 7th. I'm actually currently in Dubai. And so it's the early morning hours in the U.S. and like many of you in the U.S. at least, and certainly around the world, and watching what can only be described as a just really questionable kind of election process. And this is not a political channel, and regardless of what side you're on, and in that realm, this channel actually is going to cut across and through all of that noise, because ultimately, whether you're left, whether you're right, there are fundamental issues that ultimately rest and sit with the monetary system, which is of course at the base of society, regardless of what political party happens to be in power. So with that, let's kick things off today. You can see my very shoddy setup here, some of my favorite books in the back. And those of you who are also fans of Ayn Rand will know that one of the big things she would always say is, the very supposed proponents of capitalism, folks who are typically more right-leaning, more conservative when it comes to, kind of economic, fiscal policies, etc. Those very folks are the ones that have allowed capitalism to be just completely shit on, excuse my French, right? And, it's become this unbelievably evil thing with, that takes advantage of consumers and doesn't pay workers enough. And you have all these kind of rich, greedy, fat cats lining their pockets. And don't get me wrong, that is happening to some extent. But it's not capitalism that's causing that. It's really crony capitalism, and we'll talk about that and differentiate it. But part of the impetus for this channel is what has to me been an alarming rise of socialist tendencies, more and more kind of radical ideas towards statism, collectivism, which are fundamentally at odds with human nature, as we'll discuss. And so there should be alarm bells ringing in your head if they aren't already, based on what we're seeing. History is always an abundant and generous teacher, and what it's taught us is that you combine a ever increasing sort of bloated government, so statism, with fiat money supply. That recipe has never worked, ever in human history, right? Every single time it fails, and it fails, pretty miserably. And so to think that, we're unique or different this time is a little bit silly. But one of the things Ayn Rand would always say is, again, it's not the argument that, capitalism, it's really good at what it does. It's really good at allocating scarce resources, and it produces wealth, and sure, maybe we can agree on that. but it morally, right? It's morally objectionable. When in fact the argument we should be making is it's the only moral system that aligns with human nature, right? That's the thesis for today's video. So let's talk about what is capitalism, because the very word itself comes from a Marxist persuasion, and was labeled and used in a negative way, right? Oh, these owners of capital, and they're just rent seeking and sticking their tentacles into society, et cetera. So from its very outset, the word capitalism had a negative sort of connotation, at least to those individuals who created the term. But it's really nothing more than free voluntary exchange between humans. I mean, that's it. If you really, really boil it down, it's free, non-coercive, voluntary exchange from one human or group of humans to another, exchanging one thing of value for another. That's it. And that is fundamentally why capitalism is the best producer of wealth. It really rests on the principle of comparative advantage. Think of an overly simplistic society in which, my buddy Steve and I, we're the only two members of the society, and I'm really, really good at, fishing, and Steve's really, really good at, timber, right? Gathering and collecting timber. And so, if I want to build a house, it's going to be, really inefficient for me to learn what Steve has already sunk his time, energy, and effort into learning. And instead, and similarly, Steve needs to be able to, feed himself. And so instead of both of us spending our time to be okay at these two different activities, we can each specialize and trade. And so I can now get both goods for a lower amount of total time. And that mechanism is the fundamental key to increasing standard of living. It is the ability to trade time for ever greater quantities of goods and services. That is the definition of prosperity, and that is the unquestionable outcome of free market capitalism. Another way to think about this is, capitalism is just one system of, potentially many that allocates scarce resources in an economy, right? That's like a very, almost academic way to think about it. But, you think about it that way. Maybe let's expand our little example to make it a bit more complex. And now instead of Ian and Steve, there's a couple different actors. Now, let's say that there's 3 different districts in our little economy. And, District 1 has a certain population, District 2 has another population, District 3 has yet another. And they're all very, very different, right? They all have different needs and wants and desires. And so the way that free market capitalism figures out how to allocate scarce resources to these different diverse groups of people with diverse needs and wants is through price signals. So, by virtue of the demand from District 3 for bananas, which is way more than the demand in District 1 for bananas, as a producer, I now know that, I need to produce, 3 units of bananas for District 3 and 1 unit of banana for District 1 based on the market demand. And that's a very iterative process that's continuously fine-tuning itself, right? And so imagine taking those price signals completely out of the system with different distortions. So, let's say a big central planner suddenly comes in and, let's make that little society far more complex than the 3 districts. What are the chances that this central planner, no matter how good their intentions or how many, economics PhDs they put on their payroll, like how are they going to be able to do a better job of figuring out who should get what than the individuals themselves who have those needs and wants? It's a ludicrous idea when you think of it in that way. And so that's why any sort of central planning ultimately is less efficient than individuals being able to act and trade and exchange freely, and by virtue of those trades, communicate clear price signals to the market that make the exchange of goods and the production of goods as efficient as it possibly can be. The other beautiful part of capitalism that I think is really, really missed today by all its critics is the fact that in true capitalism, and we'll talk about what capitalism isn't after this current section, to survive in true capitalism, you have to produce something of value to another human being. You have to satisfy a need or a want for someone else. That's it. If you don't do that, if you don't satisfy someone else's desire or need or want, you will not excel in a capitalist system. And so that's a beautiful thing if you think about it, right? There's all these entrepreneurs, all these business owners who are, to use a term from Robert Breedlove, who you're going to hear a lot of different ideas that I'm sort of pulling in from him to this channel. Go check him out if you haven't already. But he has this idea of capitalism being this kind of inquiry process where entrepreneurs, business owners are constantly inquiring within the world around them to build better and better products and services at more affordable prices, et cetera, to better serve those needs and wants. And if you have that sort of virtuous cycle, you're inevitably going to produce a surplus of wealth. Whereas if you don't have capitalism, if you have different rules that say, okay, we need to produce this much of this and that much of that, and oh, by the way, if I can have political connections and favor and get away with producing a less kind of optimal good, then that you've fundamentally destroyed that process. And so it's only capitalism, no other system that necessitates production of goods and services that are truly valuable to other human beings. Okay? Let's move on now to what capitalism is not, because I think it's equally important as what we just covered, which is what is capitalism. So I think people are very quick to kind of blame capitalism for all of society's troubles, right? I mean, the drumbeat of that criticism is louder now than in a long time. And I think what we have, certainly in the U.S. and I mean certainly globally, is something called crony capitalism, and that occurs when you have participants in the market that have political connection that allows coercion of some kind, right? Coercion is the sort of key detractor from the capitalist process. The second that you start coercing people to pay a certain price for a certain good or service, or that a certain good or service has to be produced in this quantity and not that quantity, or for this new green energy we have to take money from taxpayers in order to make it economically feasible for this product to be purchased when it otherwise wouldn't voluntarily be purchased by individuals. Like, these are all distortions and forms of coercion, right? It doesn't have to be someone pointing a gun at your head and saying, you have to buy this, this set of goods, this basket of goods. Although you'd be surprised, I mean, inch per imperceptible inch towards statism is a step away from human nature. And so I think a lot of folks who have kind of taken for granted this, the huge benefits of capitalism are going to be pretty surprised if we keep going down this path. And so crony capitalism is really the reason why you rightly have a lot of criticism towards kind of these gigantic businesses. Now, what we also need to discuss, though, when we say what capitalism is not, is the money system. And in fact, as you'll see on this channel, my view and the view of many others is that that's the real root of the problem. When you have a fundamentally debt-based, inflationary fiat currency and fiat system, I mean, the global system is purely fiat, right? Since 1971, when we took the dollar off the gold standard. You have this very, very dangerous and slippery slope whereby, interest rates will inevitably go to zero, as we've seen them, do over the last really few decades. If you kind of go all the way back to the late 70s, early 80s, we've been in kind of one big cycle since then of lowering interest rates, nations that have bewildering amounts of debt that will never be paid back. Again, we'll get into a lot of that later on. But when you have at the center of the economy this fundamental system that extracts value from some and gives it to others, you definitionally don't have capitalism. A good example of that is, why do you think the Fed and other central banking institutions want you to believe that a little bit of inflation is good, right? I mean, if you think about it, how on earth could it be a good thing that losing purchasing power over time is a good thing? It doesn't make sense on its face. And then the arguments will come, well, look, it's good for wage growth. That's why they do it. Data, as we'll show in another video, would have quite a contrary opinion to that. If you look at the late 1800s to early 1900s in the US as an example, which was a largely deflationary time frame, you saw record wage growth. In fact, you saw people working fewer hours at the end of that time frame than the beginning because the value of their money went up over that period of time. And so now we're experiencing the exact opposite of that, whereby it's not overly perceptible on a day-to-day basis, but your money is getting less valuable. Your purchasing power is going down. And you see that in healthcare, you see that in education, you see that in, even food prices to some extent, depending on the category. And so this is why so many people feel like they can't quite keep up. And it's pretty disgusting. One of the really interesting websites you should go to if you haven't yet is WTFhappened in1971.com. And it'll show you an extraordinary series of graphics that, quantify the negative trends in, all sorts of things, whether it's, inequality, whether it's the number of weeks that I have to work as a citizen just to kind of pay, my rent or what have you. All of this is being driven by this inflationary fiat system that fundamentally extracts value from ordinary everyday people and transitions that value to those that are closest to the monetary spigot. So big corporations with political connections, political insiders, financial insiders, big hedge funds that are all sort of feeding at the Fed trough, if you will. That's what's happening. And that's really the underlying cause for almost everything that we see today. And so hopefully that alone is justification for why what we have is fundamentally not capitalism. So we'll talk through that again more, but because that's people's everyday interpretation of what capitalism is, you also have all these branches of, further implications for, okay, it's a zero-sum game, right? If I'm a business owner and I make a profit, I'm by definition stealing value from someone else, which is just ludicrous on its face. John Mackey, the co-founder or founder of Whole Foods, is actually a really big proponent of capitalism and what he calls conscious capitalism, which I think is a really nice framework. And it basically says, look, this notion that capitalism is purely about profit maximization isn't fully true, right? Because there's ways to maximize profits that destroy value for all the various stakeholders that come together in a business, whether it's employees, whether it's consumers, whether it's, investors, the community, et cetera, right? And so if you're dicking everyone over, eventually a market, if allowed to operate freely, is going to punish that sort of business. And so, John has a lot of really interesting thoughts on how that has shaped, public perception of kind of what capitalism is and isn't. But it really comes down to, okay, no one's enslaving people. Like, no business is enslaving people to work at that business, right? These people are voluntarily exchanging their time for a wage and other benefits. Similarly, no one's forcing a consumer to go shop at Whole Foods. They're going voluntarily, right? No one's sort of holding a gun to their head and saying, you have to shop here. And so the idea that, business owners are somehow enslaving consumers and workers is just an idea that falls on its face when you start to think through it rationally and logically. Okay, so let's talk a little bit now about why human nature fundamentally necessitates capitalism. This is an even stronger form of the hypothesis that capitalism is a moral system, not just a very productive one. And, a lot of this draws from some of Ayn Rand's writings and teachings, whereby if you think about human nature, we're not plants, okay? We don't just kind of exist and by virtue of our existence survive. We don't photosynthesize sunlight and produce the energy that we need to live and survive. Okay, check. We're not like other animals where there's instinct that highly drives the survival, the ability to survive. And so we're unique in the sense that we come into this world and that's it. Like if we didn't do anything else, we would die. And so we have to use our minds to create things that allow us to survive, whether it's shelter over our heads, whether it's, clothing to keep us warm, whether it's food to keep us nourished, and so on and so forth. And so none of that is just kind of magically provided to us at birth. And so by virtue of our very nature, we have to be able to use our minds to create the things that we need in order to survive. And by an extension of that, it would stand to reason that, I can't think for you. You listening to this right now are free to accept or reject what I'm saying. I can't, literally go into your brain and think these thoughts for you and connect the dots for you. That is kind of your volition that is operating. And so extending that further, you would then have to say, well, okay, so if I can't think for someone else, that then means that someone else can't think for me. And therefore, I need to be able to produce or exchange my time and effort for things that will help me and enable me to survive. And then you say, okay, what about sharing? And sharing is fine, right? Voluntary sharing is fantastic. But out of all of that thought process comes the notion that whatever I create or produce, I have an exclusive right to, right? Because someone can't think for me, they can't sort of create for me. And so that's up to me. And so therefore, if that's my mechanism to survive, then by extension, I have to have rights to what I produce. And this is how property rights comes out of the basic tenets of human nature and how we operate in reality in the world. And so that's the idea, right? And anything that therefore violates that principle of, taking from one and giving to another, while all of that is articulated with, pure intentions and good intentions, and we could argue whether that's actually true or not. And I think a lot of people who do advocate for, socialist regimes, like, I do think some of them are doing so with a legitimate desire to see humanity, improve, right? No doubt. But we have to acknowledge that is in violation to human nature. The second that you force the goods and services of what someone just produced, take it away forcefully, right? And I mean, taxation is that. Inflation is a form of taxation. I mean, this is not gun to the head coercion. This is coercion of any type from typically governments that have a monopoly on force and on coercion. That by definition is a step away from our fundamental human nature of being able to create, produce, and exchange freely. And so, our very core selves require a system like capitalism to operate. And so I think that's a really interesting way to think about it. Now, look, is this a perfect system? No. No single system is ever going to be perfect, right? Because humans are wildly diverse, and things change. Things are dynamic. But, so for example, and we'll talk about this in future videos, capitalism it does have some challenges when it comes to things like intellectual property rights, right? That's a big challenge. There certainly are what I'll call delays in recognition of negative externalities, right? Meaning, okay, yeah, sure, you are right that a business could come in and trash the environment they're working in, for a time before perhaps the broader population or consumers catch on and then start voting against that company with their wallets. So no doubt, there can be negative externalities. However, if markets are allowed to operate truly freely, there's going to be a higher degree of transparency, and so you're going to be able to see those externalities quicker. And oh, by the way, like, I've been really, really intrigued at, over the last probably 5, 6, 7 years, you've seen an enormous shift in corporate kind of emphasis on sustainability and, broader stakeholder, kind of equity, right? Not just sort of, investors, but thinking about the network of stakeholders, more broadly. Like, you've seen an enormous progression there because the market, i.e. consumers, are starting to vote with their wallets about what they value. And so if I'm a consumer and I value environmentally sustainable practices, I now have the ability to vote with my wallet to businesses based on whether they uphold those same values. And so you're seeing capitalism at work to solve the very problems that critics of capitalism say are being caused by capitalism. So it's a crazy world. So it's not a perfect system, but history again has been an abundant teacher that it works. I mean, if you think about the fact that, going back to my very original definition of capitalism, which is no more than humans exchanging things of value freely and voluntarily, that has been the dominant mode of existence for all of humanity. And you'll have spikes of collectivism and statism over time, and over the last few thousand years, religious institutions, state institutions confiscating wealth, and things inevitably end poorly. But if you think about the fact that capitalism really is at the core of where we've been, even as a species, and over the last few hundred years, when it's been really allowed to thrive more so than it has at any point in history, you have seen the commensurate rise in prosperity in really all societies, right? You cannot say that humanity is worse off today than it was 100 years ago, 200 years ago. Like that is abundantly false. I would invite you, to take a read of The Rational Optimist by Matt Ridley, which is an absolutely excellent book, that kind of goes into that. And so it's not a perfect system, but it is unquestionably superior to all the kind of modes of thought that are being offered up by, particularly the left, but, many folks who are going away and moving away from capitalism. It's interesting when you look at some of the, the history of this. I mentioned the history of the word capitalism itself, right? Werner Sombart, who was one of Karl Marx's buddy, popularized the term in his 1912 book, on the subject. And it's kind of interesting that Sombart went on to become a rabid supporter of another form of anti-capitalism, Nazism. So it's funny to see some of these connections. So we've covered a lot of ground. What is capitalism? What it is not? And each of these topics, can warrant many more videos. And so we'll go ever deeper down the rabbit hole. But I want to also cover, before we conclude here, where does Bitcoin fit in all of this? And we'll deep dive on the monetary system as what I believe is the fundamental source of all of these ills in society. So next video, we'll cover that in a deep degree of detail. But in summary, think about the nature of money. And again, I invoke some of Robert Breedlove's great work on the topic. If you're looking for the most poetic version of this that you will ever hear, Robert Breedlove is your man. But I think what really was a mental shift for me was thinking about money as it's just another thing. It's just another good. Think of it just like that. So, for example, think of rare art. Let's say that there's 100 pieces of rare art in the world. What would happen if we magically found 20 more? Well, as you're probably rightly thinking, the value of each of those pieces of art goes down. Similarly, if suddenly 20 of them were destroyed, the value of those remaining would go up. Right? It's fundamentally due to scarcity of something that is of value. And you think back to bartering societies where, again, I would trade my, fish for Steve's lumber, or, my bananas for, someone else's wheat. Again, same thing. These are just exchanges of goods or services. And so when you think about money as just the ultimate, most tradable thing, you can start to now intuit as to why it's a big issue if more of that thing can just be produced out of thin air, right? And that's exactly what can happen with every single fiat system on Earth today. With a keystroke, new digits, form, and we've created currency units out of thin air. Now, there's a whole long series of videos that I will do on why that's not totally true and why people think, Fed go burr, right, is not exactly true. And so we'll walk through some of those mechanics and how money actually makes it into the system, into the economy, in terms of tradable currency units. But that's for another day. But conceptually, it shouldn't be hard when you've now adopted that mindset of, okay, money is just another good and service, and it just happens to be the most kind of divisible, tradable good for other goods, right? Because it's very inefficient for me to have to trade, a couch for a dishwasher, et cetera. Instead, I can trade my couch for money that I can then trade for the dishwasher. And so in that context, any system such as fiat that is fundamentally controlled by central authorities and can be arbitrarily changed at will, that's a massive issue. That's a humongous issue. Because what that does is it now steals from all those who are participating in an economy, right? I am forced by law to do commerce in US dollars, right? If I'm in the US, or a wide dizzying array of international trade and commodities trading, and that's again a whole nother video. But that's a massive issue if you think about it, right? And the fundamental reason for this is, government as it grows needs more debt, needs to spend more, takes on more debt, and so inflation is very, very good for a debtor entity. Because some of that debt just inflates away, right? And that's all that's happening. That's the reason. That's the reason that they tell you inflation is good. There's no other reason that's backed by any amount of actual evidence. And so Bitcoin solves this problem fundamentally. We'll talk about why it doesn't necessarily have to be the case that Bitcoin has to be like literally the medium of exchange that you use to go and buy your groceries. But what we will talk about is why Bitcoin at the very least should be, needs to be, must be, if competition is allowed to reign supreme, why it must be at least the sort of core reserve asset for the world. Meaning any paper certificates that we use in everyday commerce fundamentally has to be backed by Bitcoin. And it's because Bitcoin is the first ever in the span of humanity, all of human history. It is the first fundamentally scarce monetary technology. 21 million. That is how many Bitcoin that will ever exist. And so we've never had such a predictable supply curve of a monetary good. And so its fundamental scarcity and divisibility and portability, right? I can exchange it from my phone anytime. It's just superior. It's superior to any other form of money that's ever existed. And so that's where Bitcoin fits in as the kind of bedrock of free market capitalism. In the next video, we'll go into that a lot further. We will dig into the rabbit hole of the current monetary system. Some of you, I think, are probably well aware of the evils that lurk within, and others, this is going to be super eye-opening. The more you dig, the more you're appalled, really, at the current system. And so look forward to that. Stay tuned for more. Hope you enjoyed this content. If you did, give this a like, subscribe. There's going to be a lot more content coming. And let me know what you think in the comments below. I would love to hear from you on what sort of topics you'd like to see in the future. But for now, all the best, and I'll see you in the next one.